I clawed at the satin lining above my face, my scream swallowed by 6 feet of dirt, as I realized my own children had buried me alive. The oxygen was running out, and with each shallow breath, I understood the full horror of their betrayal. They wanted me dead, and they had made sure of it. My fingers bled as I scraped against the coffin lid, the darkness pressing down on me like a physical weight. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, each pulse a reminder that I was still alive, still fighting. The air grew thinner, and I knew I had minutes, maybe seconds, before everything went black. But let me take you back to where this nightmare truly began. 6 months before I found myself trapped in a grave meant to be my final resting place. My name is Margaret Hayes, and at 72 years old, I thought I had lived long enough to understand human nature. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday morning in April, the kind of spring day that makes you believe in new beginnings. I was in my kitchen in Portland, Oregon, making coffee the way I'd done for 50 years, when my daughter Caroline walked in without knocking. She had that look on her face, the one I'd learned to recognize over her 45 years of life. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation," she said, not even bothering with a good morning. My son David followed behind her, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his expression carefully neutral. They sat down at my kitchen table like judges at a trial, and I knew whatever was coming wouldn't be good. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands steady despite the anxiety creeping up my spine. What's wrong with my living situation? I've lived in this house for 40 years. The house held memories of my late husband Robert, who'd passed away 5 years earlier, leaving me alone but independent. Caroline exchanged a glance with David, and something passed between them that made my blood run cold. "You're getting older, Mom. We think it's time you moved into a facility where you can be properly cared for." Her voice was smooth, practiced, like she'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times. David pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward me. "We've already looked into several options. There's a very nice place in Beaverton that has an opening. We can move you in next month." His tone was final, as if my opinion didn't matter at all. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the brochures for assisted living facilities. The prices made my stomach turn. These cost a fortune. I can't afford this. But even as I said it, I knew what was coming next. They weren't asking me to pay for it. "That's why we need to sell the house," Caroline said, her manicured fingers tapping against the table. "The equity will cover the facility costs for years. It's the smart thing to do." Smart for whom, I wanted to ask, but I kept my mouth shut and listened. Over the next few weeks, they wore me down like water on stone. Every day brought a new argument, a new reason why I couldn't stay in my home. They found issues with the stairs, with the maintenance, with my ability to care for myself. They painted me as helpless, confused, a danger to myself. I wasn't confused. I knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted the house, the money, the inheritance they felt entitled to while I was still breathing. But I was tired, so tired of fighting them, of defending my right to live in my own home. And so, against every instinct screaming at me to refuse, I signed the papers. The nursing home was as sterile and depressing as I'd imagined. White walls, fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant mixed with something I didn't want to identify. My room was small, barely big enough for a bed, a chair, and a tiny bathroom. This was supposed to be my home now. This prison disguised as care. Caroline and David visited once the first week, then not at all. The calls became less frequent, their excuses more transparent. "We're so busy, Mom. You understand." I understood perfectly. They had what they wanted, and I was no longer necessary to their lives. The staff at Riverside Senior Living were kind enough, but kindness doesn't replace family. I watched other residents receive visitors, grandchildren running down the halls, families gathering for birthdays and holidays. Had no one. My children had effectively erased me from their lives while I was still alive. 3 months into my stay at Riverside, I developed what seemed like a simple cold. But at 72, simple colds don't stay simple for long. The cough deepened, my breathing became labored, and within days, I was in the hospital with severe pneumonia. The doctors didn't sugarcoat it. At my age, with my weakened immune system, the prognosis wasn't good. I called Caroline and David, left messages that went unreturned for 2 days. When Caroline finally showed up at the hospital, she didn't come alone. She brought her fiancé, Thomas, a man I'd met exactly twice before. They stood at the foot of my bed, and I could see the calculation in my daughter's eyes. "The doctors say you might not make it through the week," Caroline said, her voice devoid of emotion. "We need to talk about your will, about your final arrangements." She pulled out papers before I'd even processed what she was saying, documents that needed my signature while I could still sign them. Through my fever-clouded mind, I recognized what was happening. They weren't here to comfort me, to hold my hand as I faced possible death. They were here to make sure every legal loose end was tied up, every asset accounted for and transferred. I was a transaction to be completed before the deadline. David arrived an hour later with a lawyer I'd never met. "It's just to make things easier, Mom. So we don't have to deal with probate if the worst happens." The worst. He couldn't even say the word death, couldn't acknowledge that he was planning for my funeral while I was still breathing. I signed the papers. What choice did I have? I was weak, sick, and utterly alone. The morphine made everything fuzzy around the edges, and I remember thinking maybe it would be easier to just let go, to stop fighting against children who clearly wanted me gone. The thought terrified me, but it also brought a strange sense of peace. That night, my condition deteriorated rapidly. The monitors started beeping, nurses rushed in, and I heard someone say something about calling the family. But I was falling into darkness, a warm, heavy darkness that felt almost welcoming. I thought of Robert, wondered if I'd see him soon, if death would be a relief from this betrayal. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time lost all meaning in that dark place between life and death. But I remember fragments, voices saying I was gone, someone crying but not sounding particularly sad, the feeling of being moved, lifted, transported. And then nothing but the sound of my own breathing in a confined space. When I woke up in the coffin, the terror was absolute and immediate. I was alive. I was buried. And my children had done this to me. The realization hit harder than the physical panic of suffocation. They hadn't even verified I was dead before putting me in the ground. I screamed until my throat was raw, pounded on the coffin lid until my hands were bloody and broken. The air was thick, stale, running out with every panicked breath. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The manipulation, the isolation, the systematic erasure of my life and autonomy. And I thought about how they must have felt putting me in this grave, knowing I had trusted them. But then something inside me shifted. The panic transformed into something else, something colder and more calculated. If I was going to die in this box, I would die fighting. And if by some miracle I survived, they would regret the day they decided their mother was worth more dead than alive. The rage gave me strength I didn't know I had left. I pressed my ear against the coffin lid, listening. I could hear something. Was it rain? Movement? I focused all my remaining energy on the seam where the lid met the base, pushing, pressing, looking for any weakness. The coffin was expensive, I could tell, probably chosen by Caroline to make herself feel better about the murder she was committing. Then I felt it, a slight give in the corner of the lid. Someone, probably the funeral home, had installed an emergency air tube, a small pipe that ran from the coffin to the surface. It was a standard safety feature, meant to prevent exactly this scenario, though most modern funeral homes didn't bother with them anymore. But this one had, and it was my lifeline. I positioned myself to maximize the airflow, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to conserve oxygen. I knew that if the coffin had been buried that day, the earth wouldn't have settled yet. There might be a chance, a slim one, if I could just stay alive long enough. Time became meaningless in that darkness. Hours passed, or maybe days. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind playing tricks on me. I saw Robert standing in the corner of the coffin, smiling at me the way he used to on Sunday mornings. I saw my children as babies, innocent and loving, before greed and entitlement corrupted them into the monsters they'd become. At some point I heard voices above ground. Muffled, distant, but definitely real. I screamed again, pounded on the coffin with what little strength I had left. The voices stopped, then came closer. Someone was digging. The scraping of shovels against earth was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. The lid opened and light flooded in, blinding me after so long in darkness. Hands reached down, pulled me out, and I heard someone saying, "My God, she's alive! Call an ambulance." I looked up at the faces above me. Cemetery workers, their expressions a mixture of shock and horror. One of them was vomiting in the background. "My children," I croaked, my voice barely working. "They buried me alive." The workers exchanged glances, unsure whether to believe the rambling of a woman they'd just pulled from a grave. But I repeated it over and over, until they had no choice but to listen. The ambulance came, and so did the police. As the paramedics worked on me, checking my vitals and starting IVs, I heard the officers making calls. They were investigating, taking my statement, treating this as the crime it was. Attempted murder. That's what they called it, and I felt a grim satisfaction at the term. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering. The physical damage was extensive. Dehydration, malnutrition, broken fingers from clawing at the coffin, psychological trauma that would take years to process. But I was alive, and with each day that passed, my resolve hardened into something unbreakable. They had tried to kill me, and now I would make sure they paid for it. The police investigation moved slowly, as these things do. Caroline and David claimed innocence, said the hospital had declared me dead, that they'd followed all proper procedures. They hired expensive lawyers who threw up roadblocks at every turn. But I had something they didn't expect: time and a burning desire for justice that fueled my recovery. I learned through the police that Caroline and David had moved quickly after my supposed death. They'd sold my house within weeks, split the proceeds, and Caroline had accelerated her wedding plans. She was getting married in 6 months, a lavish affair paid for with money from my home, wearing a dress bought with my inheritance. The audacity of it made me physically ill. During my recovery, I lived with a cousin I hadn't seen in years, Martha, who opened her home without question when she heard what had happened. Martha was 80, sharp as a tack, and angrier than I was about what my children had done. "They always were spoiled," she said one evening over dinner. "Even when they were little, you gave them too much." She was right. I had given them everything: love, opportunities, financial support whenever they needed it. I'd put them through college, helped with down payments on their first homes, babysat their children when they couldn't afford daycare. And this was how they repaid me. The realization of my own enabling role in creating these monsters was almost as painful as the betrayal itself. As I healed, I formed a plan. The legal system was moving too slowly, the lawyers finding technicalities and loopholes that might let my children escape justice. But I had something better than the legal system. I had the truth, and I had the element of surprise. They thought I was dead, buried, and forgotten. They had no idea what was coming. I hired a private investigator named Marcus, a retired police detective who specialized in gathering evidence for difficult cases. "I want to know everything," I told him. "Every lie they told, every document they forged, every cent they spent of my money. I want it documented and irrefutable." Marcus delivered beyond my expectations. He found hospital records that had been falsified, signatures forged on death certificates, payments made to a corrupt funeral director who'd agreed to bypass the normal procedures for verifying death. He tracked every dollar from the sale of my house, showing how Caroline and David had divided it and spent it lavishly while I was supposed to be rotting in the ground. But the most damning evidence came from a source I never expected: David's ex-wife, Jennifer. She'd been divorced from my son for 3 years, and she had no love lost for the Hayes family. When Marcus contacted her, she provided recordings of conversations where David and Caroline had discussed their plan, months before I ever got sick. They had planned this. Premeditated. Calculated. Murder. "We just need to wait for the right opportunity," Caroline's voice said on the recording. She's old, she'll get sick eventually. And when she does, we make sure she doesn't recover. The house is worth too much to wait for her to die naturally." Hearing my daughter's voice say those words, so casual, so cold, broke something in me that I knew would never heal. I listened to hours of recordings, each one more damning than the last. They discussed the nursing home as a way to isolate me, to cut me off from friends who might question what happened. They talked about the will, about making sure they were sole beneficiaries before I died. They even joked about it, laughed about how easy it would be to convince doctors that a 72-year-old woman with pneumonia had simply passed away. Have you ever discovered that the people you loved most in the world saw you as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome, a bank account to drain? That moment when you realize you were never truly loved, only tolerated until you became more valuable dead than alive. The wedding was planned for June 15th at the Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland. Caroline had sent out 200 invitations, booked a 5-tier cake, hired a band that cost more than most people's cars. The venue alone was $50,000, all paid for with money that should have been mine. I planned my arrival with the precision of a military operation. I worked with the police to coordinate my appearance. They wanted to arrest Caroline and David immediately after I revealed myself, to catch their reactions on camera, to document everything for the trial that would surely follow. Detective Sarah Chen, who'd been assigned to my case, was particularly invested in seeing justice served. "This is one of the most cold-blooded things I've seen in 20 years on the force," she told me. The day of the wedding arrived, and I stood outside the Sentinel Hotel in a black dress Martha had helped me pick out. I looked different than I had 6 months ago. Thinner, harder, with gray hair I'd stopped coloring and eyes that had seen death up close. I looked like someone who had clawed her way out of a grave, because that's exactly what I was. The ceremony was in progress when I walked in. Caroline stood at the altar in her white dress, Thomas beside her, both of them smiling like they hadn't committed murder. David sat in the front row with his new girlfriend, playing the role of supportive brother. The room was full of people who had no idea they were celebrating with killers. I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that fell over the room. People turned, gasped, some screamed. Caroline's face went white as she saw me, and David stood up so fast he knocked over his chair. The officiant stopped mid-sentence, staring at me like I was a ghost. In a way I was. "Hello, Caroline." "David." My voice was steady, cold, nothing like the mother they'd buried. "Surprised to see me. You should be. You buried me alive 6 months ago, and somehow I survived." The room erupted in chaos, people shouting questions, Caroline trying to speak but no words coming out, David backing away like I might attack him. Detective Chan and her team entered through the side doors, moving toward my children with handcuffs ready. "Caroline Hayes, David Hayes, you're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder." The reading of their rights echoed through the hotel ballroom, mixing with Caroline's screams and David's protests. I stood there and watched as they were handcuffed, as their perfect facade crumbled. Caroline looked at me, and in her eyes I saw not remorse but anger. Anger that I'd survived, that I'd ruined her wedding, that I was still alive to take back what they'd stolen. "You're insane," she screamed at me. "You're a crazy old woman, and everyone will see that." But I wasn't crazy, and I had proof. Marcus stepped forward with the recordings, the documents, the evidence that would bury them far more effectively than they'd buried me. I turned to the assembled guests, these people who'd come to celebrate while knowing I was supposedly dead. "Did they tell you how I died?" I asked the silent room. "Did they say I passed peacefully? Did they cry at my funeral, play the grieving children?" My voice rose, months of rage finally finding release. "They buried me alive. They falsified medical records, bribed funeral home workers, and put their own mother in the ground while my heart was still beating. All for money. All for a house and an inheritance they couldn't wait to claim." The guests stood frozen, some crying, others looking sick. Thomas had backed away from Caroline, clearly processing that his bride-to-be was a would-be murderer. The wedding planner was on her phone, probably canceling everything. And I stood in the center of it all, The mother who refused to die, who came back from the grave to deliver justice. As the police led Caroline and David away, Caroline turned back to me one last time. "I wish we'd checked," she said, her voice venomous. "I wish we'd made sure you were really dead." It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years, and it confirmed everything I'd known. Given another chance, she would do it all again. The trial took 8 months to reach a verdict. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The recordings, the falsified documents, testimony from the corrupt funeral director who'd turned state's evidence to save himself. The defense tried to paint me as a vengeful old woman who'd faked her own death to frame her children, but the medical evidence was irrefutable. I had nearly died in that coffin. I testified for 3 days, describing in detail what it felt like to wake up buried alive, to realize your own children had done this to you. The jury sat in stunned silence as I showed them my scarred hands, the result of clawing at the coffin lid. Several jury members were crying by the time I finished. Caroline and David showed no remorse throughout the trial. They maintained they'd done nothing wrong, that I had been declared legally dead by medical professionals, that they'd simply followed procedure. But the recordings betrayed them, their own words convicting them more effectively than any prosecutor could have. The verdict came back guilty on all counts: attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse. Caroline received 25 years, David got 20. The judge, a woman in her 60s, said during sentencing, "You didn't just try to kill your mother. You tried to erase her, to take everything she'd worked for and built, while she was still alive. The court shows you the same mercy you showed her, none." I sold my story to several media outlets. The money from those interviews paid for the legal fees and allowed me to buy a new house, smaller than the old one but mine. I donated a substantial portion to elder abuse prevention organizations, hoping my nightmare might prevent others from suffering the same fate. Martha moved in with me after the trial ended. At 82, she said she was tired of living alone anyway, and she'd grown accustomed to our conversations over morning coffee. We were 2 old women who'd survived children who'd tried to destroy us in different ways, finding companionship in our shared understanding of betrayal. The years have passed, and I'm 75 now. Caroline and David write letters sometimes, asking for forgiveness, for visits, for money for their commissary accounts. I burn every letter without reading past the first line. Forgiveness might be virtuous, but I have no virtue left where they're concerned. They made their choice when they put me in that coffin, and I made mine when I survived it. I think about that day in the coffin often, the darkness, the terror, the absolute certainty that I would die alone and forgotten. But I also think about the moment I felt that given the coffin lid, the moment I decided I would rather die fighting than accept their version of my ending. That decision saved my life, and it destroyed theirs. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty for sending my own children to prison. They say family should forgive, that holding grudges only hurts yourself. But those people weren't buried alive by their children. They didn't wake up in darkness knowing their own blood had sentenced them to a horrible death. Forgiveness is a luxury I can't afford, and guilt is an emotion I reserve for things I've actually done wrong. I've made peace with what happened in my own way. I lived through something no parent should have to experience, and I came out the other side changed but whole. The scars on my hands remind me every day of what I survived, of how close I came to letting them win. I don't regret exposing them, destroying their lives the way they tried to destroy mine. My story made national news, spawned a documentary, became a cautionary tale about elder abuse and family betrayal. People stop me sometimes, recognize me from interviews, tell me I'm brave or inspiring. I don't feel brave. I feel like someone who did what they had to do to survive, who refused to be a victim even when victimhood was easier. The house Caroline and David forced me to sell was bought by a young family with 3 children. I drive by sometimes, watch them playing in the yard where my grandchildren once played. The new owners renovated, painted it a different color, erased any evidence that I ever lived there. Maybe that's how it should be. The past buried properly this time, not clawing its way back to the surface. I've reconnected with old friends who'd lost touch after I moved to the nursing home. They tell me they called, tried to visit, but were told I didn't want to see anyone. More of Caroline and David's lies. More evidence of how systematically they'd isolated me. These friends welcome me back without judgment, and slowly, I'm rebuilding a life that's mine, not controlled by people who saw me as currency. Martha and I have developed rituals. Sunday morning coffee on the porch, Friday night mysteries on television, monthly visits to the cemetery where I was buried. That last one might seem morbid, but I need to see that empty grave, to remind myself that I climbed out of it. They've filled it in now, planted grass over it, but I know where it is, and I visit my own grave marker that they never bothered to remove. The marker reads, Margaret Hayes, beloved mother and grandmother, 1953 to 2024. The dates are wrong, obviously, and the sentiment is a lie. But I leave it there as a monument to their cruelty, proof that they celebrated my death even as they caused it. Other cemetery visitors sometimes ask about it, confused by the living woman visiting her own grave, and I tell them the truth. Every time. I've thought about writing a book, a full account of everything that happened. My lawyer thinks it would sell well, that people are hungry for true crime stories with justice served. But some parts of that experience are too dark to share, too personal to commodify. The hours in the coffin, the moments when I thought I'd die, the visceral terror of suffocation, those belong to me alone. What I can share is this. At 75 years old, I've learned that survival is not just about staying alive. It's about deciding what kind of life you want after trauma, about refusing to let the people who hurt you define your ending. Caroline and David thought they were writing my obituary when they put me in that ground. Instead, they gave me a resurrection story, and I'm the one writing the ending now. I date sometimes, which surprises Martha. At your age, she teases, but she's happy for me. There's a widower named Frank who volunteers at the library where I spend Tuesday afternoons. He knows my story, read about it in the papers, and he says it doesn't scare him. You're a survivor, he told me on our first coffee date. That's attractive at any age. Frank lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago, understands grief and betrayal in his own way. He doesn't press me to talk about the coffin or the trial, but he listens when I need to process it. Some nights we sit on my porch and don't talk at all, just exist in companionable silence, two old souls who've earned the right to peace. I've become something of an advocate for elder rights without meaning to. Organizations ask me to speak at conferences, to share my story with social workers and law enforcement. I do it, hoping that maybe someone will recognize the warning signs in time, will save another elderly person from being discarded by their own family. The looks on people's faces when I describe being buried alive, that horror, that empathy, those make the retelling worth it. The grandchildren I mentioned briefly, Caroline and David's children, have reached out now that they're adults. They want to know my side of the story, to understand why their parents are in prison. I meet with them carefully, aware that they're innocent victims of their parents' choices. Some of them believe me, choose to maintain a relationship. Others think I'm lying, that I somehow orchestrated this to hurt their parents. I can live with that division. My grandson Tyler, David's oldest at 28, visits monthly. He was 19 when it happened, old enough to remember me before the nursing home, before the burial. I should have questioned it, he says every time he visits. When they said you died so suddenly, I should have asked more questions. I tell him he's not responsible for his father's sins, but guilt isn't logical, and he carries it anyway. The nightmares have lessened over the years but never fully disappeared. I still wake sometimes in the middle of the night, gasping for air, feeling the coffin walls closing in. Martha hears me on those nights, comes in with tea and presents, sitting with me until the terror passes. You're here, she reminds me. You're alive. They lost. It helps most of the time. I've taken up painting of all things. Martha suggested it as therapy, a way to express what I can't put into words. My paintings are dark, abstract things that make sense to me in ways I can't explain. I paint a lot of tight spaces, of breaking through barriers, of light piercing darkness. An art therapist who saw them at a local gallery show said they were the visual equivalent of a primal scream. That felt right. The house I live in now is one story, all open floor plans, with windows that let in maximum light. I couldn't bear to live anywhere with basements or small enclosed spaces. Even elevators trigger panic attacks sometimes. But I'm working through it, slowly reclaiming my sense of safety in a world where I now know the worst can happen from the people you trust most. I've thought about what I'll do if Caroline and David are ever released. They'll be in their 60s by then, roughly the age I was when they buried me. The irony isn't lost on me. Will they be changed by prison, remorseful, seeking genuine forgiveness? Or will they be angrier, more resentful, blaming me for their incarceration? I don't know, and I don't spend much time wondering. That's a problem for future Margaret. Present Margaret focuses on smaller things. The taste of Martha's apple pie, the way Frank laughs at my jokes, the feel of a paintbrush in my hand. These small joys are how I wage war against the darkness my children tried to bury me in. Every moment of happiness is a victory, proof that they failed to kill not just my body but my capacity for joy. Tyler tells me his mother, Jennifer, wants to write a book about the case from her perspective. I've given her my blessing. She lost years of her life to David's manipulation and abuse, different from mine but no less real. If sharing her story helps her heal, I support that. We've become unlikely allies, bonded by our shared victimization by the same family. The victim impact statement I read at sentencing has been studied in law schools as an example of how elder abuse cases should be prosecuted. Professors contact me sometimes, asking if I'll speak to their classes. I do when I can, wanting future lawyers to understand that their elderly clients are whole people with stories, not just case numbers. The law failed to protect me until after I nearly died. Maybe I can help it do better for others. I've learned that forgiveness is overrated. Society pushes this narrative that you must forgive to heal, that holding on to anger poisons you. But my anger didn't poison me, it saved me. It gave me the strength to claw out of that coffin, to expose my children, to rebuild my life. I've channeled that anger into advocacy, into awareness, into action. That's healthier than any hollow forgiveness could be. Martha and I joke sometimes about writing a sitcom. Two old ladies living together, one who was buried alive by her kids, one who was financially ruined by hers. Dark comedy gold, Martha says. We laugh about it, and the laughter is real, proof that trauma doesn't have to define every moment. We've earned the right to find humor in our survival. I'm asked often if I ever loved Caroline and David, if there were good years before everything went wrong. The answer is complicated. I loved who I thought they were, who they were as children before entitlement and greed corrupted them. But those people might never have existed outside my own wishful thinking. Maybe they were always capable of this, and I was too close to see it. The recordings Marcus found went back further than I knew. There were conversations from years earlier, Caroline and David discussing how much longer they'd have to wait for me to die naturally. I was in my late 60s then, healthy and active. They couldn't wait for natural causes. That knowledge, that they'd been planning my death for years, is somehow worse than the act itself. I've become hyper-aware of how society treats the elderly, how easy it is to dismiss, ignore, or warehouse people once they reach a certain age. The nursing home where they placed me wasn't unusual. I see it everywhere now. Elderly people treated like problems to be solved rather than humans to be valued. My case was extreme, but the underlying disregard for older lives is systemic and heartbreaking. Frank's daughter didn't want him dating me at first. She's too controversial, she told him, meaning the publicity around my case made me unsuitable. Frank told her to mind her own business, that he was 73 and didn't need her permission. I appreciated that. His willingness to choose me despite the complications. His daughter eventually came around, apologized, said she'd been wrong to judge. I've set up a trust for Tyler and the other grandchildren who've maintained contact with me. It's not large. I'm not wealthy after the legal fees, but it's something. I want them to know that I don't hold their parents' sins against them, that family can be rebuilt even after betrayal if both sides are willing. It won't repair everything, but it's a start. The anniversary of my burial falls in November, and every year I mark it privately. Not as a celebration but as a remembrance. I survived. I'm here. They failed. Martha makes my favorite meal. We light a candle, and we toast to survival and justice. It's become our ritual, a way of acknowledging the darkness while refusing to let it win. I think about the funeral they held for me, the empty ceremony where Caroline and David probably cried false tears. Were they convincing? Did people comfort them, tell them what wonderful children they were to their mother? The thought makes me sick, but it also fascinates me. The performance of grief while knowing you've committed murder. The psychology of it is chilling. The therapist I see monthly says I have complex PTSD, which makes sense given the circumstances. We work on grounding techniques for when the panic hits, ways to remind myself I'm not in the coffin anymore. Some days are harder than others. Some days I can barely leave the house. But I push through because staying alive, truly alive, is my revenge. I've received letters from other elderly people who've read my story, who recognize elements of their own lives in mine. The isolation, the pressure to give up their homes, the children who see them as burdens. I try to respond to all of them, to offer whatever wisdom I've gained from my experience. Sometimes I can help them see the warning signs in time. Sometimes I'm too late. There's a particular cruelty in being betrayed by the people you raised, loved, and sacrificed for. Every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every sacrifice I made to give them better lives. All of it was calculated by them as an investment they expected to cash in on. They saw my love as debt they were owed, and when they decided the debt was due, they came to collect with interest. Martha's children tried something similar with her, though less extreme. They convinced her to sign over power of attorney, then drained her accounts and left her destitute. She fought back legally, got some of it back but not all. We're a good match, she and I. We understand each other's particular flavor of betrayal. It's a sad basis for friendship, but it's also a profound one. I've wondered if I failed as a mother, if I could have raised them differently and avoided this outcome. My therapist says that's survivor's guilt talking, that I'm not responsible for my children's choices as adults. But the question haunts me anyway. What did I miss? What signs did I ignore? Could I have stopped this before it started? The truth is probably that I couldn't have stopped it. Caroline and David made their choices based on who they are at their core. People who value money over human life, who see family as transactional. I could have been a perfect mother, and they still would have buried me for the inheritance. The flaw is in them, not in how I raised them. I've started a blog about elder rights and family betrayal. It's small, but it has a following. People who've experienced similar betrayals, or who want to prevent them, or who just find my story compelling. I write about the small victories and the hard days, about rebuilding after being torn down by the people who were supposed to protect you. The comments section has become a support group of sorts, people sharing their own stories of surviving family betrayal. One woman wrote to tell me her son had tried to convince her she had dementia so he could take control of her finances. She remembered my story, recognized the pattern, and fought back before it was too late. She kept her independence and cut him off completely. Stories like hers make everything I went through feel purposeful, like my suffering wasn't meaningless if it helps even one person avoid the same fate. Frank proposed last month. At 75 and 73, we both laughed at the absurdity and romance of it. We might have 10 good years left if we're lucky, he said, and I want to spend them with you. I said yes, not because I need marriage to feel complete, but because I want to choose joy after years of pain. We're getting married at the courthouse next month. Just us and Martha as witness. I've thought about inviting Tyler to the wedding, about extending that olive branch further. He's the only one of my grandchildren who's consistently shown up, who's tried to understand rather than judge. But weddings are supposed to be happy occasions, and his presence would bring reminders of his father, of the family that tried to erase me. Maybe some bridges are meant to stay partially burned. The media interest has finally died down, which is a relief. For 2 years after the trial, I couldn't go to the grocery store without being recognized. Couldn't live a normal life without someone wanting to hear the story again. Now I'm just another old woman buying milk and bread. And that anonymity is precious. I've had enough drama to last several lifetimes. I still have the clothes I was wearing when they buried me. Martha thinks I should throw them away, that keeping them is unhealthy. But they're evidence of something, proof that I survived the unsurvivable. The dress is torn, stained with dirt and blood from my broken fingers. I keep it in a box in the closet, and sometimes I take it out and remember that I'm stronger than I ever knew I could be. The cemetery where I was buried has become an unlikely tourist destination. People come to see the grave of the woman who climbed out of her own burial, take pictures, leave flowers. The cemetery management tried to stop it, but eventually gave up and just made sure visitors were respectful. I find it bizarre, this macabre tourism, but if my story fascinates people enough to visit an empty grave, so be it. Tyler brought his girlfriend to meet me last week. She knew who I was, had heard the story, but she treated me like a normal grandmother rather than a celebrity survivor. We had coffee, talked about their plans, their lives, normal things. For 2 hours, I wasn't the woman who was buried alive. I was just Tyler's grandmother, and it felt like a glimpse of the life I should have had all along. I've been asked to consult on a movie about my story. Hollywood wants to dramatize it, make it into a thriller with a satisfying ending. I've resisted because I don't think my trauma should be entertainment, but the money would be substantial. I'm considering it now, thinking I could donate most of it to elder abuse prevention. Maybe good can come from letting strangers consume my worst moments. The lawyer who represented Caroline and David in the trial has since been disbarred for ethics violations in another case. Apparently, I wasn't the only person he'd helped someone try to murder for profit. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing that everyone involved in the conspiracy against me has faced consequences. Justice isn't always blind, sometimes she sees clearly. I've reconnected with my cousin Helen, who I hadn't spoken to in 40 years due to a stupid family argument I can't even remember now. Life's too short, and death's too permanent, to waste time on grudges that don't matter. Helen's 78, lives in Seattle, and we video chat weekly now. She's got her own children problems, though thankfully less murderous than mine. Martha's health has been declining lately. She's 85 now, and the years are catching up with her. I help her the way she helped me, and there's a beautiful symmetry to it. We've become each other's family, chosen rather than blood, and that choice feels more meaningful than the family that tried to destroy me. She jokes that when she dies, she wants me to make sure she's really dead before they bury her. The physical scars have faded somewhat. My hands still ache in cold weather, and I can't make a tight fist anymore. The doctor says it's permanent nerve damage from clawing at the coffin lid. Every time I look at my hands, I see evidence of my fight to survive. Some people might see them as disfigurement, but I see them as badges of honor. I've been invited to speak at a TED Talk about survival and family betrayal. The organizers want me to share my story on a platform that reaches millions. I'm terrified at the prospect but also intrigued. My voice could reach so many people, could maybe prevent this from happening to someone else. I've agreed to do it next year, giving myself time to prepare. Caroline's letters have changed in tone recently. The earlier ones were angry, accusatory, blaming me for her imprisonment. The recent ones are different. She claims to have found religion in prison, says she's a changed person who understands the magnitude of what she did. She wants my forgiveness, says she prays for me daily. I still burn the letters, but now I feel something close to pity along with the rage. David's letters are fewer and more pragmatic. He asks about his children, about whether I'll support them financially since he can't. There's no mention of remorse or apology, just practical concerns about his offspring. It's the most honest communication we've had in years. He's not pretending to care about me, just about what I can provide. I appreciate the honesty even as I refuse his requests. The nursing home where they warehoused me has been shut down following a state investigation prompted by my case. Inspectors found dozens of violations, evidence of neglect and abuse that had been ongoing for years. Families have filed lawsuits, and I've been contacted to testify in several cases. It's exhausting, but if my testimony helps others get justice, it's worth it. I've taken up gardening, which surprises me. I never had time for it when I was younger, too busy raising children and managing a household. Now I spend hours in my small backyard, planting flowers and vegetables, watching things grow from seeds to full bloom. There's something healing about nurturing life after coming so close to death. Frank's children have all accepted me now, welcomed me into their family with warmth that my own children never showed. His daughter apologizes every time she sees me for her initial reaction. I tell her I understand. Nobody wants their widowed father dating a woman with my kind of baggage. But she's become something like a friend, and her acceptance means more than she knows. I think about Robert often, wonder what he would have done if he'd lived to see what his children became. Would he have seen the signs I missed? Would he have believed me if I'd told him they were isolating me, pressuring me to give up my home? Or would he have sided with them, thinking I was being paranoid in my old age? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. The documentary about my case won an Emmy for Outstanding Investigative Journalism. I watched the ceremony from my living room, saw the filmmakers thank me in their acceptance speech for being brave enough to share my story. It was surreal, seeing my trauma turned into award-winning content. But if it raises awareness about elder abuse, if it saves even one life, then maybe the exploitation is worth it. I've established a scholarship fund in Robert's name for students studying elder law and gerontology. The fund is small, but it pays for one student's tuition each year at Portland State University. I want young people entering these fields to understand that the elderly aren't just statistics or case files. We're people with stories, with value, with rights that need protecting. Tyler's gotten engaged to the girlfriend I met, and they've asked me to attend the wedding. It's a bittersweet invitation. I want to celebrate his happiness, but weddings remind me of Caroline's wedding, of crashing it with police escorts and exposing her crimes. Tyler understands my hesitation, says he won't be hurt if I can't come. I'm still deciding. The panic attacks have become less frequent but more intense when they do occur. Last week I had one in the grocery store, triggered by the tight aisles and fluorescent lights that reminded me of the coffin and hospital. Frank found me hyperventilating in the cereal aisle, talked me through it with patience and understanding. I'm grateful for people who don't treat my trauma as a burden. I've been interviewed by psychology researchers studying family betrayal and elder abuse. They want to understand the psychological profile of adult children who harm their parents, the warning signs that might predict such behavior. I tell them about Caroline and David's entitlement, their inability to see me as a person rather than a resource. Maybe future researchers can use this data to identify at-risk elderly people before tragedy strikes. Martha and I have started volunteering at a local senior center, leading a support group for elderly people who've experienced family betrayal or abandonment. It's not a large group, 6 to 8 regular members, but the bonds we've formed are profound. We share our stories, validate each other's pain, and remind each other that we're not alone. It's become the highlight of my week. The house Caroline and David forced me to sell was damaged in a recent storm. Part of the roof collapsed, and the repairs will be extensive. I know I shouldn't feel satisfaction at this news, but I do. That house held 50 years of my memories, and they sold it without a second thought. Seeing it damaged feels like karmic justice, though I know that's petty of me. I've written a letter to my younger self, the Margaret who was signing away her house while her children pressured her. I tell her to fight harder, to trust her instincts that something's wrong, to call a lawyer before it's too late. I tell her she's stronger than she knows, that she'll survive things she can't imagine surviving. I keep the letter in my desk drawer, read it when I need reminding of how far I've come. The trial transcripts are public record, and sometimes I read through them when I can't sleep. I read the testimony from the cemetery workers who found me, their descriptions of pulling a living woman from a grave. I read the prosecutor's closing arguments about the depths of familial betrayal. I read Caroline's testimony where she swears she believed I was dead. The lies are obvious in retrospect, and I wonder how I ever believed anything they said. I've been contacted by a woman whose mother was buried alive in the 1970s but didn't survive. She wants to talk to me to understand what her mother might have experienced in those final moments. It's the most difficult conversation I've had, describing the terror and hopelessness while knowing her mother felt the same but had no rescue. We cried together on the phone. Two strangers bonded by the worst way to die. Frank and I got married last Tuesday at the courthouse with Martha as our witness. I wore blue instead of white, and we exchanged simple bands that cost less than $100. Afterward, we had lunch at a diner we both love, and it was perfect. No drama, no reminders of the past, just two old people choosing happiness. Martha toasted us with coffee, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. I've started writing down my story in full, not just for the blog but as a complete memoir. The process is painful, forcing me to relive every moment from the coffin to the courtroom. But it's also cathartic, giving me control over my narrative in a way I didn't have when everyone else was telling my story. The working title is Unearthed: A Mother's Survival and Revenge. Tyler came to visit last week and brought something unexpected: a letter David had written to him, asking Tyler to beg me for forgiveness on his behalf. Tyler refused to deliver it, but he showed it to me anyway. David's letter was full of self-pity and excuses, blaming his actions on financial pressure and Caroline's influence. There was no real accountability, no genuine remorse. I told Tyler he'd made the right choice in not delivering it. The nightmares have evolved. Instead of reliving being buried, I now dream of saving others from the same fate. Breaking open coffins, pulling people out, fighting against faceless antagonists trying to bury the elderly alive. My therapist says my subconscious is processing my trauma by making me the hero instead of the victim. I prefer these dreams, even though I still wake up exhausted. I've been invited to testify before a state legislative committee considering new laws to protect elderly people from predatory family members. The proposed legislation would require multiple doctors to verify death before burial, make it harder for adult children to gain power of attorney, and increase penalties for elder abuse. My testimony could help pass these laws, could create protections that might have saved me if they'd existed before. Martha's daughter reached out after years of estrangement, wanting to reconcile. Martha is cautiously optimistic, but I see the fear in her eyes. The fear of being hurt again by someone who's already betrayed her. We talk about it over coffee, about whether forgiveness means giving people another chance to hurt you. Neither of us has good answers, but the conversation itself is healing. I've calculated that I spent approximately 14 hours in the coffin before being rescued. 14 hours of darkness, terror, and suffocating heat. 14 hours of believing I would die alone, betrayed by my own children. When I have bad days, I remind myself that I survived those 14 hours. I can survive anything now. The private investigator Marcus, who helped gather evidence against Caroline and David, has become a friend. He stops by occasionally with updates on similar cases he's working, asking my advice on how to approach elderly victims who might be too afraid or confused to report their abuse. I help when I can, feeling like I'm paying forward the help he gave me when I needed it most. I've been asked to write an op-ed for the New York Times about elder abuse and family betrayal. It's an intimidating platform, but the reach could be enormous. I've started drafting it, trying to balance my personal story with broader social commentary about how we treat aging parents, how easily the elderly can be exploited and discarded. The editor wants it by next month. Caroline's youngest daughter, my granddaughter Emma, reached out through social media. She's 25 now, has a daughter of her own, and wants her child to know her great-grandmother. The request breaks my heart because Emma was only 16 when everything happened, barely old enough to understand. She wasn't complicit in her mother's crimes, but reconnecting with her means reopening wounds I've worked hard to heal. I agreed to meet Emma and her daughter at a neutral location, a park midway between our homes. Seeing Emma was like looking at a ghost of Caroline before she became a monster. Her daughter, my great-granddaughter Lily, is 3 years old with curly red hair and my late husband's eyes. Holding her, I felt something I thought I'd never feel again, the uncomplicated love of family without betrayal lurking underneath. Emma asked about that day, about the coffin and the wedding and everything between. I told her the truth, didn't sugarcoat or minimize what her mother had done. She cried, said she'd suspected something was wrong back then but was too young to do anything about it. I told her she wasn't responsible for her mother's choices. The same thing I tell Tyler. We're meeting again next week. The TED Talk is scheduled for 6 months from now, and I'm already nervous. Speaking to a room full of people about the worst experience of my life feels impossible some days. But I've been practicing with Frank and Martha, refining what I want to say, how I want to present not just my trauma but my survival. The organizers tell me it could be one of the most viewed talks of the year. I've donated all the money from the media interviews and the documentary to a foundation that provides legal aid to elderly victims of family abuse. It was more than I expected, enough to fund several years of free legal services. Every time I think about how that money came from my suffering, from commodifying my trauma, it makes me sick. But if it helps others avoid my fate, maybe it's redemption of a sort. Martha had a small stroke last month. She recovered well, but it was a stark reminder that our time together is limited, that everyone I love will eventually leave. I've become hyper-aware of mortality in a way I wasn't before being buried alive. Death doesn't scare me anymore. I've looked it in the face and won. But losing people I love to natural causes, that terrifies me. I've been working with the screenwriters on the movie adaptation, helping them understand the nuances of my experience. They want to add a dramatic confrontation scene between me and Caroline that never happened, want to make it more cinematic. I've insisted they stick to the truth. Reality was dramatic enough without embellishment. They've agreed mostly, though I suspect the final film will still take liberties. Tyler's wedding is next month, and I've decided to attend. It won't be easy, facing the ghosts of Caroline's wedding and everything that happened there. But Tyler deserves to have his grandmother at his wedding, and I refuse to let his father's crimes rob him of that. Frank is coming with me for support, and Martha's making me a new dress that doesn't carry any memories. I've started a podcast called Surviving Family, where I interview other people who've experienced betrayal by family members. The stories are heartbreaking and empowering in equal measure. Elderly people defrauded by children, siblings who've stolen inheritances, families torn apart by greed and entitlement. Each episode ends with resources for listeners who might be experiencing similar abuse. It's become unexpectedly popular. The Emmy-winning documentary has been shown in medical schools and elder care facilities across the country as training material. Nurses and doctors who've watched it have contacted me to say it changed how they view elderly patients, made them more alert to signs of abuse and neglect. This impact, this concrete change in how professionals approach elder care, feels more meaningful than any personal justice I received. I've written to Caroline for the first time since the trial. Not to forgive her but to explain why I can never forgive her. I described in detail what those 14 hours in the coffin felt like, the physical pain and the emotional devastation. I told her that her religious conversion means nothing to me without true accountability, without accepting full responsibility for trying to murder her mother. I doubt she'll understand, but I needed to say it. Frank's son has asked me to speak at his medical school about recognizing elder abuse. I've agreed, wanting future doctors to understand that their elderly patients might be victims of family members they're supposed to trust. I'll show them pictures of my scarred hands, tell them about the warning signs I displayed that nobody noticed or cared to investigate. If even one doctor becomes more vigilant because of my presentation, it will be worth reliving the trauma. The blog has grown beyond what I imagined. I now have guest writers, other survivors of family betrayal who want to share their stories anonymously. We've created a community of people who understand that family isn't always safe, that sometimes survival means cutting ties with the people who gave you life. The comment sections are full of people thanking us for giving voice to their experiences. I've been approached by several publishers interested in my memoir. The advances they're offering are substantial, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, to leave something for Tyler and Emma and my great-granddaughter Lily. I'm negotiating with 3 different publishers, trying to find one who understands that this isn't just a true crime story but a commentary on how society treats its elderly. Martha and I celebrated our 5-year friendship anniversary last week. 5 years since I moved in with her after being pulled from the grave. 5 years of healing together and building chosen family. We made a pact that night. Whoever dies first, The other will make absolutely certain they're dead before allowing burial. We laughed, but the promise was deadly serious. The state legislation I testified for passed last month. Oregon now has some of the strongest elder protection laws in the country, requiring multiple physicians to certify death before burial, making it harder for family members to isolate elderly relatives, and increasing criminal penalties for elder abuse. The governor mentioned my case specifically when signing the bill. My suffering has created change, and that provides a measure of peace. I've been thinking about my own mortality differently now. I'm 75, statistically have maybe 10 to 15 years left if I'm lucky. But those years are mine, earned through surviving what should have killed me. I'm not afraid of death anymore. I've already been dead in the eyes of my children, already been buried and mourned. Whatever comes next can't be worse than what I've already survived. Tyler's wedding was beautiful and bittersweet. Watching him exchange vows, I thought about what Caroline lost, the chance to see her son marry, to be part of his life, to meet her future grandchildren. She traded all of that for money and a house, and she's spending her best years in prison. The tragedy of her choices isn't what she did to me but what she did to herself. I danced with Tyler at his wedding and he whispered, "Thank you for being here, Grandma. Thank you for surviving." I couldn't speak, just held him tighter and tried not to cry. He introduced me to his new in-laws as the strongest woman he knows, and the pride in his voice almost broke me. This is what family should be. Chosen love, not obligated tolerance. Frank and I have settled into married life with surprising ease. We're both old enough to be set in our ways, but we found a comfortable rhythm of companionship and independence. He works on his model trains in the spare room, I write in my office, and we come together for meals and conversation. It's a peaceful life, the kind I never imagined having after being buried alive. The movie rights sold for more than I expected. The production starts next year, with a major actress attached to play me. It's surreal, thinking of someone studying my mannerisms, learning my story inside out to portray me on screen. The filmmakers have promised to donate a portion of profits to elder abuse prevention organizations. At least Hollywood is making something good come from entertainment based on suffering. I've reconnected with more old friends, people who knew me before the nursing home, before the burial, when I was just Margaret, wife, mother, volunteer at the church, member of the book club. They tell me I've changed, that there's a hardness to me now that wasn't there before. I don't deny it. You can't claw your way out of your own grave and emerge unchanged. Emma has become a regular presence in my life. She brings Lily over twice a month, and we're building something fragile but real. Emma asks questions about Caroline, trying to reconcile the mother she knew with the woman who tried to murder her own mother. I answer honestly but carefully, aware that Caroline is still her mother, that my monster is still her mom. The podcast has expanded to include expert interviews, lawyers specializing in elder law, psychologists who study family dynamics, social workers who've seen abuse firsthand. We're creating resources, not just sharing stories. I've been told that social workers are using podcast episodes as training materials, playing them for new hires to illustrate what elder abuse looks like in real life. I've calculated that Caroline and David stole approximately $350,000 from me when you add up the house sale, my savings they accessed with power of attorney, and the life insurance policy they collected on my supposed death. The court ordered restitution, but they'll never be able to pay it back. The money's gone, spent on weddings and cars and vacations while I was supposedly rotting in the ground. Martha's health continues to decline slowly. She's been hospitalized twice in the past 6 months for complications from her earlier stroke. Each time, I sit beside her bed and remember how she sat beside mine when I was recovering from the coffin, how she opened her home without hesitation when I had nowhere to go. The thought of losing her fills me with a grief I haven't felt since Robert died. The TED Talk is in 2 months, and I've been rehearsing obsessively. 15 minutes to summarize years of trauma, betrayal, survival, and advocacy. The organizers want me to focus on resilience and overcoming, but I insist on including the darkness. You can't understand the survival without understanding what had to be survived. They've agreed, though they're nervous about how the audience will react. I've been asked to appear on several national news programs to discuss the movie and the continued impact of my case. I've declined most of them, tired of being the woman who was buried alive, wanting to be just Margaret again. But I've agreed to one interview with a journalist who's promised to focus on elder abuse prevention rather than the sensational details of my story. Caroline responded to my letter. Her reply was defensive, angry, accusing me of being cruel and unforgiving. She says she's made peace with God and that should be enough, that I'm holding on to bitterness that will destroy me. Reading her words, I felt nothing but pity. She still doesn't understand what she did, still sees herself as the victim. Some people are incapable of true remorse. I've started mentoring a younger woman whose father tried to have her declared incompetent to steal her inheritance. She's only 55, but early-onset dementia runs in her family, and her father used that fear to manipulate her into signing over control of her finances. I'm helping her navigate the legal system, sharing the strategies that worked for me. She's fighting back, and I'm proud of her. Tyler and his wife announced they're expecting a baby. I'm going to be a great-great-grandmother, and the joy I feel is complicated by the knowledge that Caroline will never meet this child, that David won't either. They've lost everything because of their greed, and they'll never even know what they've lost. The baby is due in 6 months, and I've already started knitting blankets. Frank's health has been excellent, knock on wood. At 74, he's more active than men half his age, walking 3 miles daily and volunteering at the library 4 days a week. He jokes that being married to me is keeping him young, that he's too busy supporting me to have time to age. I joke back that he's my proof that not all families are poison, that choosing the right person late in life can still bring happiness. The New York Times op-ed was published last month and went viral. Millions of people read it, shared it, commented on it. I received thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories of family betrayal, of elderly parents being exploited, of the systemic failures that allow this abuse to continue. The response was overwhelming and heartbreaking and ultimately hopeful. People are paying attention now. I've been invited to speak at the United Nations about elder abuse as a human rights issue. The invitation came from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and I've accepted despite my terror at the prospect. If my story can influence international policy, can help create protections for elderly people globally, then standing on that stage and reliving my trauma will be worth it. Martha died last Wednesday in her sleep. She was 86 years old, and the doctor said it was peaceful, that her heart simply stopped. I was the one who found her, and even though I knew intellectually she was gone, I checked for a pulse multiple times, made sure she was really dead before calling anyone. The irony wasn't lost on me. I've become the person who verifies death because I know what happens when people get it wrong. The funeral was small, just me, Frank, Martha's estranged daughter, and a few friends from the senior center. We buried her in the same cemetery where I was buried alive, but in a different section, far from my empty grave. I stood at her graveside and thanked her for saving me, for being the family I needed when my blood family tried to destroy me. I promised her I'd make sure she stayed dead, that she'd rest peacefully. It was the strangest promise, but it felt necessary. Martha left me her house in her will. Her daughter contested it briefly, but Martha's lawyer had extensive documentation of her daughter's abandonment and financial abuse. The house is mine now, but I can't bear to live in it, can't sleep in the room where I found Martha's body. I'm renting it out, using the income to fund the scholarship program and elder abuse prevention work. The grief over Martha's death has been profound and complicated. I'm grieving not just her but the safety she represented, the proof that chosen family could be stronger than blood family. Frank helps, but he didn't know Martha the way I did, didn't understand what she meant to my survival. I feel alone in a way I haven't since those first days after being pulled from the coffin. Tyler and his wife named their baby Martha, after learning how much she meant to me. The gesture moved me to tears, this recognition that my chosen family mattered, that my granddaughter-in-law understood something profound about survival and love. Little Martha was born healthy at 7 pounds, 3 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly. I held her and felt hope for the future in a way I hadn't in years. The TED Talk happened last month. I stood on that stage in front of 1,500 people and millions more who would watch online, and I told my story. I described the coffin, the betrayal, the survival, and the advocacy that came after. I talked about how society treats its elderly, how easy it is to discard people once they're no longer productive. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, and I used every second to compose myself before walking off stage. The talk has been viewed over 10 million times in the 6 weeks since it aired. I've received interview requests from Oprah, from major news networks, from international media outlets. I've declined most of them, exhausted by being a public figure, by having my worst moments replayed and analyzed endlessly. But the impact has been undeniable. Elder abuse hotlines reported a 300% increase in calls the week after the talk aired. I've started having nightmares about Martha, dreams where she's calling for help but I can't reach her, where I find her too late to save her. My therapist says it's displaced guilt, that I'm processing my inability to save her from natural death the same way I processed surviving when others didn't. Grief is complicated when you've already faced death so intimately. Caroline was denied parole last month. She'll serve at least another 15 years before she's eligible again. She's 50 now, will be 65 before she has another chance at freedom, older than I was when she buried me. David has 10 more years on his minimum sentence. They'll both be elderly by the time they're released, if they're released at all. The irony isn't lost on me. I wonder sometimes if they think about what they did, if they have nightmares about me clawing my way out of the coffin. Hope they do. I hope they wake up gasping, imagining the darkness and the terror. I hope they feel a fraction of what they put me through, though I doubt they're capable of that kind of empathy or self-reflection. The memoir is finished. Unearthed, A Mother's Survival and Revenge, will be published in 6 months by a major publisher. The advance was substantial enough that I've established a foundation in Martha's name to provide housing assistance for elderly people fleeing abusive family situations. If my trauma can prevent homelessness and further abuse for others, then maybe sharing every painful detail was worth it. I've been contacted by researchers studying the long-term psychological effects of being buried alive. Apparently, there are fewer than a dozen documented cases of people surviving live burial in the past century, and I'm one of only 3 who are alive and willing to participate in research. The studies are helping develop better protocols for verifying death and treating survivors of extreme claustrophobic trauma. Frank and I took a vacation to Hawaii, my first real vacation in a decade. We swam in the ocean, ate too much, and didn't talk about death or betrayal or trauma for an entire week. It was heaven. Sitting on the beach, watching the sunset, I realized I'd built a life worth living after surviving the unsurvivable. That realization felt like the final victory over Caroline and David. They tried to end my story, and instead they just added an unexpected chapter. The movie premiere is next month. I've been invited to walk the red carpet, to do interviews about seeing my life portrayed on screen. I'm nervous about how they've depicted me, whether the actress captured the complexity of my experience, whether Hollywood sensationalized or minimized what happened. But I'm also curious to see my story through someone else's eyes, to understand how the outside world views what I lived through. Emma's thriving in ways her mother never did. She's in therapy, processing her own trauma of having a mother in prison for attempted murder. She's a good mother to Lily, breaking the cycle of entitlement and cruelty that defined Caroline and David. Watching her parent with patience and genuine love, I see hope for the next generation, proof that family dysfunction doesn't have to be inherited. I've been asked to write a second book, this time about recovery and building a life after trauma. The publisher thinks there's an audience for the practical aspects of survival. How to navigate relationships after betrayal, how to manage PTSD, how to find purpose in advocacy. I'm considering it, though I'm tired of mining my pain for public consumption. Maybe there's value in showing people the after, not just the during. Tyler's become an advocate in his own right, speaking at events about breaking family cycles and recognizing abusive patterns. He talks about growing up with Caroline and David, the warning signs he missed or ignored, the guilt he carries for not protecting me. His honesty is raw and painful,